In January 2014, the sheriff of a small town in Oregon discovered something on a farm that shocked all the residents. The discovery was so eerie that it could have been the basis for the most sophisticated horror films. Susan Monica led an ordinary lifestyle that many might even consider successful. She had several close friends and a good job as an engineer. Susie also lived in one of the most impressive cities, San Francisco, California. However, despite all this, Monica was not satisfied. The fact was that moving to a big city was more of a necessity than a dream for Susie, given the developing circumstances. Ultimately, the move allowed her to work and earn good money. In reality, Susan preferred peace and tranquility. She loved being alone. But living in such a big city was not easy. Every evening when she came home from work, she sat in her favorite chair and dreamed. She dreamed of moving away, settling somewhere in a village far from the hustle and bustle, farming, growing vegetables, and raising animals, ensuring a decent life for herself. One day in 1991, when Susan was already 43 years old, her dream came true. She managed to earn and save money, enabling her to buy a farm with 8 acres of land. The farm was located in the forest in Weimar, Oregon. In reality, it was a small house without a barn for animals, without running water, and not even with electricity, a hut surrounded by wilderness without even neighbors. But for Susie, who was tired of city life, this purchase was perfect. Nature was far from people. Moreover, the woman was of strong build and a professional engineer with experience. She knew how to build a home effectively, cost-efficiently, and comfortably. Susan was not afraid of physical work. Within a few months, the neglected plot of land in the forest turned into a neatly built small farm with many stalls for animals. The woman also built a cozy house where she lived. Susie began raising pigs, adding new breeds to the herd every month. However, after establishing a household, she realized it was very difficult for her to manage it alone. She had to get up early every morning, prepare food for the animals, and clean the stalls. The work was hard. Besides, she had several other projects and simply not enough hands for everything. Susan Monica realized that no matter how much she wanted to spend time alone, she needed to find helpers whom she could pay for fulfilling some tasks. She printed flyers announcing that she was ready to hire someone to take care of the animals. Soon, people started coming to her company. Most of them were not very well off, for example, people who had difficulty finding a permanent job due to a series of problems, issues with documents, a criminal record, or a nomadic lifestyle. Few people were willing to hire such individuals for official jobs, but for Susie, it didn't matter. The only thing that concerned her was that her pigs were fed, the stalls were cleaned, and the workers did not bother her with their attention. Over the next 20 years, Susan Monica would employ several hundred workers. Workers came and went, most not staying long. Some saw the farm work as a part-time job for 1 or 2 weeks. Others managed to work for the woman for several months, but they were always people constantly searching for a better life. After the hired workers left her farm, she knew nothing about their further fate. Every time Susan found herself without assistance, she would post ads throughout the town again to find laborers. Almost everyone in the small town knew Monica as a woman fixated on her farm and always selling fresh meat. On January 1st, 2014, Susan, who was 66 years old at the time, was working in front of her hut, cleaning up the chaos. When she heard noises, she looked up and saw a car approaching her house. Susan was surprised. She lived in the forest and still had no neighbors. Guests came very rarely, usually by appointment, but this time she was expecting no one. The car stopped next to her. 3 young people got out of the car, 2 men and a woman. The strangers were the first to start a conversation. It turned out that the 3 were looking for their father, Robert Haney, who had previously told them he was working on Susan's farm. Earlier, Robert used to visit his children at least every few months. Now, they hadn't heard from their father for 6 months. Since Robert had no permanent residence and no personal phone, the youngsters had no way to contact their father. So they decided to personally search for Haney to make sure everything was fine with their father. Susan Monica was shown a photo of a man and asked if she knew Robert. He might still be working for her or had quit, but Susan might know where he could be. This visit was a complete surprise for her. She had never had guests before, and the woman treated the visitors attentively, even though she didn't like communicating with strangers. Susan said that last spring, she indeed hired a man named Robert. Haney also had a dog he cherished. The man performed his duties diligently, was efficient, and not intrusive. But 5 months later, in August, Robert changed drastically. He started abusing alcohol, avoided work, and was constantly confused. Susan was annoyed by the presence of a drinking man on her property. She told him to leave her farm as Monica no longer wanted to work with him. The next day, Robert Haney approached the owner, handed her an envelope with money, said he had to leave for a while, and asked Susan to take care of his dog in his absence. After that, the man left, and Monica never heard from Robert again. It turned out that Haney's belongings were still stored in a trailer on the farm: clothes, personal notebooks. But one thing especially caught the youngsters' attention: their father's tool belt. Robert worked part-time with repairs all his life, and it was very strange that he disappeared for 4 months without taking his tools with him. The youngsters thanked Susan and asked her to immediately inform them by phone if she had any information about their father. After leaving the farm, Robert's children went straight to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office to file a missing person report. The police took their statement, but immediately said it was difficult to find a person without permanent registration and without a personal mobile phone. However, since crimes were common in the area, the officers were interested in Robert Haney's personality. Maybe the man who led an unstable lifestyle did something illegal and was now hiding from everyone. The young people were asked to recall every detail that could help the investigators find the man. At some point, Robert's son remembered that his father had a social card on which money was deposited monthly, and from which he received state benefits. The card could be used to buy things, which was at least something. It took a few days to track the transactions. It turned out the card was used in a store near Susan's farm just a month ago. When the investigators checked the surveillance cameras in the grocery store, it became clear that Robert did not shop there. But on that day, Susan Monica shopped at the supermarket, using Haney's social card, which was very suspicious. When they returned to the police station, the officers immediately obtained a search warrant for the farm where the woman lived. A few days later, on January 10th, the sheriff and his deputies arrived at Susan Monica's property. The woman met the police at the door and was hospitable. The officers reported that they had come in connection with the case of the missing Robert Haney to search her property. The sheriff asked Susan to show him around the house, while the rest of the police stayed in the yard and began inspecting the area outside the house. The sheriff and Susan sat in the kitchen and started talking. The woman repeated the same story she had told Robert's children. But when the officer pointed out that Susan had recently used Haney's social security card, the woman said, "Oh yes, I forgot to mention, Robert gave me his card along with the envelope of money, so I could buy food for his dog since the dog was still with me, and I had to feed and take care of it." Susan also added that she couldn't use Robert's card if she had stolen it because she needed a PIN code, and the man had given her the password himself. The sheriff was skeptical and continued asking questions to confuse her. But Susan Monica spoke confidently and remained steadfast in her answers. In the end, the sheriff concluded that the farm owner was likely telling the truth. The case seemed to be at a dead end, and there was nothing to complain about. The officer stood up, thanked Susan for the conversation, and was about to leave. At that moment, his assistant ran into the house, leaned over to the sheriff, and whispered something in his ear. The officer turned pale at the information he received. He looked at Susan in horror and said, "You need to come with us to the police station." While she was in the interrogation room, Susan looked agitated. She didn't understand what was going on and why she was detained. The investigators then turned on the surveillance cameras and asked her a question. "Has there ever been a case where a person died on the premises of your farm?" Susan stared at the investigator for about a minute, seemingly not knowing what to say. But after a pause, the woman began her story. Everything Susan Monica had previously said about the missing Robert Haney was true, except for one small detail she had overlooked. After Robert left her farm 6 months ago, he recently returned, which was a month ago. One early morning, Susan woke up to feed her animals. When she entered the pigsty, she saw a strange sight. Normally, the pigs would lie lazily, waiting for food, but not this time. That morning, the animals were gathered in a part of the pen, seemingly surrounding something and trying to examine it with interest. When Susan realized something odd was happening, she began to push the pigs away, and as she reached the center, she saw Robert. The man was lying on his back with his intestines torn out. But the most shocking part was that Robert was still conscious, groaning, and moving his hand. Susan tried to pull Robert out, but her animals behaved aggressively, continuing to attack the victim and tear pieces off him. The woman realized it was impossible to save Haney and decided to ease the unfortunate man's suffering. Susan returned to the house, grabbed her gun, went back to the pigsty, and shot Robert, thus performing an act of mercy by ending Haney's suffering. She then collected Robert's remains in bags and threw them into a trash heap in her barn. It's evident that the man's remains were still there because during the search, a police officer entered Susan's house and whispered to the sheriff, "Sir, we found a human leg." It was Robert's leg, and it was found not in a trash heap, but in the middle of the yard, out in the open. Most likely, a wild animal sneaked into the barn and dragged the bag with the man's remains out. When asked why she didn't call the emergency services when she found Robert, Susan replied that she was afraid her pigs would be punished after the incident. The animals could simply be put down, and in that case, Susan would lose her main source of income. Even if the pigs weren't euthanized, the news of the incident would quickly spread throughout the village, and people in the area would simply refuse to buy meat from her. Susan Monica was subjected to a lie detector test. During the test, the woman constantly fidgeted and coughed, trying to ensure that the readings she provided were inaccurate. The procedure had to be stopped. Susan was warned that her entire farm would be searched if she didn't stop resisting the investigation. If the investigators managed to find something she hadn't already told them, the woman would be in serious trouble. At that moment, Susan Monica stopped fidgeting. She looked at the police officers, and after a long pause, she asked for a piece of paper and a pen, after which she began diligently drawing something on the paper. After a while, it became clear that Susan was drafting a plan of her farm. Then she placed a large cross in the middle and said, "If you go to this place, you'll find Steve here." Everyone in the room was surprised. It was about Robert. Who was Steve, and what did he have to do with it? It turned out that Steve had worked on her farm in 2012 before Susan hired Robert. Initially, he was also very efficient, but then the woman caught the employee stealing. Steve wanted to steal the owner's gun. At that moment, there was a struggle between Steve and Susan, during which the gun accidentally went off in the man's hands. Steve fell wounded in the middle of the pigsty. Suddenly, the pigs attacked the unfortunate man and began to tear him to pieces. The woman didn't call the police either, fearing her pigs would be harmed and she would lose her income. The villagers would definitely refuse to buy fresh meat from her. In fact, there was no evidence contradicting her stories, no matter how unbelievable the farm owner's tales about what happened to Robert and Steve were. When Susan stood trial, her fate was entirely in the hands of the jury. It was only a matter of whether the people in the courtroom would believe her story, and they did not. On April 21st, 2015, a year after Robert Haney was reported missing, Susan was convicted of murder and abuse of the victim's body in 2 cases. The woman was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Later, it turned out that about 17 more people were missing in the area. These were men who did not lead a very prosperous lifestyle and could have worked on Susan Monica's farm at different times. However, no evidence or other remains were found during the search of the woman's farm, so the disappearance of these people remains a mystery to everyone. Everyone says to choose your enemies carefully, but also choose your friends carefully, because they can become enemies. This is a story about a friendship between women that ended very tragically. The protagonist of today's case is Renee Marston from Sydney, Australia. She grew up with her 3 siblings in the family of Teresa and Mark Marston. There was always a warm atmosphere in her home, but Renee was particularly close to her mother. They had a wonderful relationship, and Teresa described her daughter as a very kind, cheerful, and loving girl. In 2010, Renee turned 18. At that time, she worked in a hair salon as a foreman and administrative assistant. In the salon, she met a man named Angus, who also worked there. At first, they didn't notice each other, but then Angus realized he had fallen in love. It took him a long time to muster the courage to approach the girl and tell her about his feelings, until he discovered that Renee had feelings for him too. Within a few weeks, they became inseparable, and 2 months later, they made plans for their future life together. But soon, their relationship came to an unexpected and heartbreaking end. One day, Renee received a message from Angus. He wrote that he had only been using her all those months and often had a wild desire to sleep with other women. At that moment, Renee's world turned upside down. A measured life, plans for the future, and happy moments all seemed so insignificant to the betrayed girl that she just wanted to disappear somewhere. She stopped going outside, stopped eating, and was ready to spend days under the covers. In high school, Renee had a friend named Camilla Zidan. Because each had their own private life, the girls spent most of their time apart. But when Camilla found out about the trouble in Renee's relationship with her boyfriend, she dropped everything and rushed to cheer her up and support her through her grief. Camilla advised her to just spend time with other guys. She even had a suitable candidate for her. Camilla said she knew a man she believed would be good for Renee and could help her forget about Angus. It was Braden Spiteri. He was once Camilla's friend, but their relationship didn't work out because they weren't compatible. However, she was 100% sure that Renee and Braden were meant for each other. She didn't mind her friend dating Braden because she couldn't find a better partner. At first, Renee refused to meet anyone. She didn't want to look at guys at all, but as the initial pain of the breakup subsided, she decided to give Braden a chance. Thus began their phone romance. From the first message, Renee felt incredibly close to this man. She hadn't seen him in person yet, but she already felt that invisible connection you get when you meet a soulmate. They constantly texted each other on social media, exchanging countless messages day and night. Braden was 23 years old. He was a graduate of an exclusive royal school and came from a wealthy family that owned a profitable construction business. When Renee told her mother Teresa about Braden, she was incredibly happy. He seemed perfect to her. There were many commonalities between them, and the young man wanted everything from life that Renee herself dreamed of. The only downside was that Braden was always busy. When it came to dating, he didn't refuse to meet, but he always had an excuse for why they couldn't spend time together. In January 2012, a few weeks after their relationship began, Renee went on a 2-week family cruise. During this trip, she had no cell service at all, so she was out of range for a while. As soon as she returned home, she received devastating news from Braden. Long ago, a man and his close friend were involved in a serious motorcycle accident. The friend didn't survive. Braden was driving the motorcycle. Investigations revealed that he was negligent and inattentive as a driver, so he was charged with negligent homicide. During the proceedings and court hearings, he couldn't tell her about it. He was afraid that this would upset the girl he liked. But now that he had been sentenced to 2 years in prison, he couldn't keep her in the dark. Renee was devastated by this terrible news, but still decided to continue the relationship. After Braden was arrested and put behind bars at the Goulburn Correctional Center, he was allowed to use a phone. Braden and Renee resumed contact, and the messages reached a new level. They couldn't talk on the phone and only exchanged messages because he told her he risked losing phone privileges if he was caught talking. As for visits, he waived that right to shorten his sentence and try to be released by Renee's 21st birthday. He dreamed of celebrating this event with his girlfriend. Renee was compromising, at least for the moment. She believed that 2 years would pass unnoticed, and then they would marry, and nothing could separate them. For the sake of a future together, she could endure some restrictions, because now it was about overcoming this short, difficult time. Although Spiteri was behind bars, they spent a lot of time online discussing their wedding, honeymoon, and what life would be like after their marriage. Renee even reached out to the consulate to ensure that Braden could travel abroad for their honeymoon despite his criminal record. In turn, Braden found opportunities to send her flowers and gifts to make her happy. He fully understood how difficult it was for her to cope without physical contact, so he offered her to satisfy her intimate needs, not with other men, but with his best friend, Camilla. He had no objection to Renee's contact with the girl and would even be happy if she took up his offer. But Renee categorically refused this idea, saying she would simply wait for him to come home. The same couldn't be said about Camilla. She seemed very interested in the topic of intimacy with Renee. The friend constantly asked for details of the correspondence with Braden, inquired how she was dealing with her physical needs, and sometimes became very intrusive. Camilla called several times a day. If Renee didn't answer, she bombarded her with hundreds of messages. Strangely, she became jealous of Renee's other friends. Even if the girl spent the entire day with her mother, Teresa, Camilla would complain. One night, she called Renee 54 times. The next morning, Renee answered her and said that she was being very possessive and it was going beyond all reasonable limits. Instead of apologizing for disturbing her, Camilla showed up at Renee's house and began to scold and attack her. Truly rude and unpleasant things came out of Zaidan's mouth, things Camilla never expected to hear from someone she considered her best friend. After a verbal tirade, Camilla suddenly stepped forward and tried to kiss Renee on the lips. But Renee rejected this intimacy, as she was only physically attracted to men. Camilla didn't give up. She somehow persuaded her friend to have a physical relationship with her, after which Renee talked to her mother, Teresa, and said they had experimented. Renee was once again convinced that same-sex love wasn't for her, and hurried to tell Camilla. After this incident, the friends decided to leave everything as it was and forget about the event. But despite everything, Zaidan continued to act strangely. Renee even showed her mother several emails from Camilla, in which she expressed her unwavering love and desire to be together. The friend wrote that Renee wouldn't escape her feelings, and that no one would love her more than Camilla. Camilla promised to become one with Renee and follow her everywhere if she rejected her. Renee would eventually become her steady girlfriend. Teresa listened to her daughter's revelations and was worried. In an emotional outburst, some people could do terrible things out of love and then regret it. Therefore, she advised her daughter to end the friendship without giving reasons for the breakup. The woman assured her that Camilla would calm down over time, find a young man, and forget her fantasies. But Renee wasn't ready to stop everything all at once. Then Teresa asked her to at least be very careful. When Renee had no choice but to end their decades-long friendship to protect her peace, Camilla literally lost her mind. She became cruel and nervous but still kept in touch with Renee. At first, Renee simply ignored her. Over the next week, her relationship with Braden also began to strain because he often talked about Camilla and tried to persuade his friends to reconcile. After his persistent persuasion, Renee even made several attempts to break up with him. But every time she ended her relationship with Spiteri, something tragic happened in his life, and he turned to her for help. The kind Renee felt sorry for the guy who had suffered so many misfortunes at once and returned every time. At first, the friend said his mother had a brain tumor. This was a blow to him because he couldn't be near her at that moment. On another occasion, he was attacked in prison and seriously injured. Just as Renee felt that Braden was becoming toxic and was ready to denounce it, something had to happen. Each time, her parents convinced their daughter to end the relationship with this man, or at least not refuse to date and communicate with other men who showed her attention. They hoped she would leave him forever as soon as the bond with Braden weakened. To atone for his guilt, Braden even contacted her parents several times to convince them that he was truly suitable for their daughter and had the best intentions for Renee. He continued to send love messages to his girlfriend and urged her to reconcile with Camilla and ultimately forgive her. It worked. Renee reconnected with the only person who had always supported her relationship with Braden. 3 months into their relationship, the incredibly in-love Renee went to a tattoo studio with her best friend as moral support and got Spiteri's name tattooed on the right side of her chest. One afternoon, Renee's mother, Teresa, was browsing social media and came across a photo posted by her daughter's ex-boyfriend, Angus. She liked the photo and left a reaction without hesitation. Somehow, Braden noticed Teresa's activity and concluded that she did it deliberately to reconcile Angus with Renee. He sent her a very angry, rude message saying she had betrayed him and was a useless mother because she didn't support her daughter's feelings for Spiteri. He was actually furious and said many nasty things. After this incident, Renee's parents' feelings towards her boyfriend only worsened. They considered him rude and arrogant. No matter how hard their daughter tried to reconcile, Teresa remained persistent. A few months later, her mother agreed to talk to Braden. She offered him a compromise, to give Renee freedom at least until his release from prison. If her feelings didn't cool during this time, Teresa would change her attitude towards him. Surprisingly, the young man agreed. He told Renee that he still loved her and was determined to marry her as soon as he was released, but would give her complete freedom for now. The girl took this opportunity and soon started dating her colleague, Ian. Renee's parents were pleased that Ian was not like Braden. He had good manners and knew how to behave. They already hoped everything had changed. But Spiteri, who closely followed Renee's life, immediately noticed changes in her. He learned about Ian and started terrorizing the guy online to scare him away from his girlfriend, whom he had freed. Renee asked Braden to stop texting her, but eventually resumed regular communication at the friendship level. Renee quietly continued her relationship with Ian, thinking she had sorted everything out with Spiteri. In October 2012, she went on a business trip and was photographed in a hotel room next to a mirror. She later uploaded the photo to social media. She didn't expect this photo to elicit a reaction from Braden. He noticed a pair of men's shoes in the background and flew into a delusional rage, accusing her of cheating. Renee had to restore order again to maintain the friendship, explaining that they were Ian's shoes. But Spiteri didn't calm down. He somehow got the guy's number and started threatening him. Despite all his attempts to ruin his girlfriend's life, Renee and Ian got engaged on New Year's Eve. Now, constant contact with the ex was a big problem, and Ian informed his fiancée and gave her an ultimatum, either him or Braden. The time for the man's release was gradually approaching. It was supposed to happen in the fall of 2013. Renee knew about it and weighed the pros and cons for a long time, but in the end, she chose the love of her life, Braden. They started working together again to restore their relationship, but everything was very difficult. The girl was tormented by emotional swings. Braden said his father was pressuring him to take over the family's multi-million-dollar construction business once he was free, but that was not what he wanted to do with his life at all. When Renee asked him to at least listen to his father and think about this together, the man accused her of greed, claiming she was only with him for financial reasons and didn't care about his mental and emotional well-being. Moreover, he constantly blamed her for her relationship with Ian, calling her unfaithful and trying to make her feel guilty every time. This toxicity paralyzed Renee, but within minutes, Braden would switch and become a very loving and caring person again. In the summer of 2013, Camilla went on a family trip to the USA, and Renee took this opportunity to finally end her friendship with her. For the girl, it was easier to do this from a distance. Lately, Zaidan had become extremely intrusive again, using her old tricks of being defiant and possessive towards Renee. Renee was already beginning to fear her friend. So as soon as Camilla landed in the USA, she received a message from Renee asking her never to bother her again and to act like strangers if they met. Before his upcoming parole hearing, Braden told Renee that he couldn't communicate with her for a month. She had just broken up with her best friend Camilla and now had to live another month without Braden. The girl was very lonely all these weeks. She continued to send him emotional and loving text messages, hoping to get a response someday. Renee tried to be patient and wait quietly. When the response finally came, the lovesick girl was surprised by the tone of the message. Braden was very brief and rude. Later that evening, Teresa, Renee's mother, received another message from Spiteri, telling her to take care of her daughter's suicide threat. The alarmed woman hurried to ask her daughter about it. Renee said that her relationship with him was finally over, but there was no need to worry. She didn't want to hurt herself. When her mother tried to find out the details, the daughter said that she now knew who Braden was. She assured Teresa once again that everything was fine and she had no reason to worry. Then she got dressed to go out with friends later and left her home in Glebe Harbor. On August 5, 2013, at 5:49 p.m., Renee sent a very long and loving text message to her mother, telling her she loved her and asking for forgiveness. Teresa immediately dialed her daughter's number, but Renee didn't answer. Then the woman called Camilla to find out what was going on, even though they hadn't communicated recently. Camilla also received a similar message. She suggested that Teresa search for her daughter in a place where she thought Renee might go. The two went to the house where Zidane said Braden's sister lived, but no one was there. After that, Teresa contacted the police to report her daughter missing. After some time, the police found Renee's car in Watson Bay, an area outside the city. Inside were an old phone she hadn't used in the last 2 months, a Valentine's card from Braden, and a collage of several photos of him. "I love you, Braden," was written on the dirty car window with a finger. Renee's parents, along with several close family members, started searching for Renee. They stumbled upon a pair of the girl's black ballet shoes. At that moment, the police cordoned off the search area and persuaded the family to go home and wait for the results with their loved ones. Teresa couldn't just sit idly by. She tried to contact Braden, but he didn't answer the phone or read the text messages the angry Teresa sent, convinced that he had somehow contributed to her daughter's disappearance. The girl's father then called the correctional facility where Spiteri was supposedly being held, but there were no records of an inmate by that name. These records were nowhere to be found. Mark immediately reported his concerns to the police. When the officers first searched the Watson Bay area, they didn't find Renee but found video footage of her last moments. Alone, the girl walked the path leading to the edge of the cliff, jumped over the barrier, and looked down. She then took out her phone, sent the last 3 texts, threw it into the sea, and then jumped herself. Her body was never found. Overwhelmed by sudden grief, the family didn't immediately realize that Renee was most likely dead. Her parents were determined to get answers and find out who she had been communicating with and about what recently. As it turned out, Renee had sent Braden a total of 91 text messages before she even left the house to go to Watson Bay. But the guy remained stubbornly silent. Only when Renee took off her shoes and prepared to jump did she receive a reply. Investigators examining Renee's phone records noticed a strange pattern in the messages from Camilla and Braden. Their sudden mood swings were almost identical. When Camilla was cruel to Renee, Braden was inexplicably angry at the girl and vice versa. In happy moments, Braden was also incredibly sweet. Although these messages came from 2 different phone numbers, they actually came from the same person. This meant that Braden Spiteri was actually a fictional character created by Camilla. One of the last messages on Renee's phone was from Braden, stating that he needed a break and was ending their relationship after 18 long months. Renee's colleagues witnessed her emotional breakdown. She began to shake, tears flowed, and she could hardly speak. After calming down a bit, Renee picked up the phone and called Braden in prison for 92 seconds, according to outgoing call records. After the police obtained a search warrant, they searched Camilla's house. Officers found several mobile phones, a torn letter to Braden, and another letter to Camilla thanking her for introducing her to the love of her life and promising to repay her somehow. They also found a photo of the man, presumably Braden, whose real name was Cameron, but he was not the same person Renee had corresponded with for a year and a half. It was a photo of a random guy who had no idea his identity was being used for a virtual romance. Renee spent the last 18 months of her life believing she was in love, but on the day of her death, she realized Braden wasn't real. Camilla admitted she had deceived her best friend by posing as Braden, but since there were no laws in New South Wales at the time prohibiting this, the police had nothing to charge her with. She hadn't extorted money from Renee to prosecute her for fraud. Everything she did was for her own pleasure. In 2020, Renee's parents convinced the authorities to investigate their daughter's death and find out how Camilla directly contributed to it. Camilla was granted immunity in exchange for details of her deception. Camilla, who got away with her actions, claimed that she and Renee were in love, and since the Marston family would never accept this relationship, they created the character Braden together as a cover for their relationship. Camilla also insisted she had no idea about Renee's desire to commit suicide. But those close to the deceased girl believed that ending the relationship between Braden and Renee was just revenge on her friend, after Renee finally broke up with her. Camilla was painfully obsessed with Renee but couldn't have her, so she lured her into this online relationship and created a male version of herself. Sadly, this cruel joke led to the death of a young girl. Currently, it is known that Camilla got married, had a child, and is enjoying life. The woman finally decided to partner with a man as she realized same-sex romances were not truly her destiny. Ivan Jesus Orteguera Quinteros was born on May 19, 1995, in the small town of Ergamino in Buenos Aires province, Argentina. Ivan grew up there in a house owned by his parents. Besides Ivan, his parents, Father Juan Domingo and Mother Nancy, had 5 other children: Bruno, Lucia, Franco, Martina, and Delfina. Quintero's family members described the young man as cheerful, energetic, and full of life, with a gentle yet persistent character. His biggest dream was to become a professional soccer player. He seemed to have a natural talent for the sport, and his skills were recognized by both his relatives and his teammates at the provincial football club. On May 13, 2011, Ivan entered into a romantic relationship with his girlfriend, Tamara Noela Nunes. Ivan and Tamara had known each other for about 2 years, and initially their relationship was purely platonic. However, as they grew older, a romantic relationship developed between them. The 2 teenagers exchanged sweet texts and photos daily, expressing their love and affection for each other. At that time, Tamara was 2 years younger than her 16-year-old boyfriend. She lived with her father, a man named Norberto Fabian Nunes. The girl's biological mother, Maria, lived separately but still saw her daughter frequently. Fabian, Tamara's father, had multiple jobs. During the day, he earned his living by laying tiles, and in the evenings, he worked shifts as a security guard at a car wash. Sometimes, he also worked at a nightclub. These jobs required good physical fitness and a strong physique, and Fabian could boast both. Often, he had to intervene in fights and resolve conflicts that occurred at the nightclub. It is worth noting that Fabian, to put it mildly, disapproved of his daughter's relationship. He even repeatedly threatened the young man, demanding that he break up with his daughter. One day, Fabian caught the young man at his house. Ivan wasn't just sitting in the living room or kitchen, but was in a passionate embrace with young Tamara. The sight made Fabian furious, and he immediately threw the young man out, demanding that he never set foot in their house again. Nevertheless, the young couple continued to meet and sometimes spent the night at the girl's mother's house. Tamara herself had an excellent relationship with both Ivan's parents and his siblings, and none of them saw a problem with the teenagers being together, unlike Fabian. Fabian was so unhappy with the situation that he sought a conversation with the young man's father. The conversation took place on January 6, 2012, and was unpleasant. Fabian went to the bar where Juan Domingo worked and warned him that the relationship between the 2 young people could end badly for Ivan. When asked why he was preventing the teenagers from being friends, Fabian replied that his daughter was having serious academic and disciplinary problems because she was spending too much time with the boy. After this conversation, Fabian repeated his previous warnings several times before leaving the house. He threatened Juan more explicitly, saying he would personally throw his son out of the window if he caught him at their house again. That evening, as usual on Thursdays, Fabian went to work at the car wash. He left the house in the late afternoon, intending to return earlier than usual. His daughter stayed in the apartment at that time. After her father left, Tamara sent a message to her boyfriend, asking him to visit her. The young couple knew they had to keep an eye on the time because Ivan had to leave the apartment before Fabian returned, or at least after he came home from work and fell asleep. However, that night, the teenagers fell asleep and woke up only in the early morning hours when they heard the angry shouts of the father who had caught them together again. Without hesitation, the girl's father grabbed the sleepy young man, dragged him out of bed, and started beating him. Tamara tried to intervene in the conflict and begged her father to stop the beating, but he didn't seem to hear his daughter's words. In the same apartment, but in another room, lived the girl's cousin, Lucrecia Nunes, and her mother, Ivan Helena. When they heard the noise, they ran to the room where the fight was happening and tried to calm Fabian down. Realizing that the man had completely lost control, Lucrecia asked her sister to call their mother and brother. Maria and her brother Nestor, who lived a kilometer away, arrived at the scene immediately. However, the arrival of his ex-wife didn't calm the man, but instead increased his aggression. He switched his attack from Ivan to the women, hitting Ivan Helena in the face and Maria in the chest. The incident lasted about an hour and a half. After a while, Fabian stopped beating the young man and resorted to another form of aggression, showering him with insults. The attacker demanded that Ivan jump out of the window on his own accord. The exhausted teenager desperately pleaded with Fabian not to throw him out of the window, but the attacker persisted. Despite Ivan not resisting, Tamara's father delivered several targeted blows, breaking his nasal septum and jaw. As a result of his injuries, the young man immediately lost consciousness. Shortly after, the attacker lifted the collapsed body of the victim, smashed his head against the window, and threw him out. At the time of the fall, the boy was still unconscious and unable to make a sound or move his arms and legs. This fall resulted in Ivan's almost immediate death. This tragic incident occurred around 9:30 a.m. The police arrived at the scene shortly after the incident, followed by an ambulance requested by the officers. The doctors immediately recognized Ivan's death and assisted Tamara, who was running down the stairs. The girl repeatedly claimed that the young man had jumped out of the window. Meanwhile, the police officers went to the apartment on the 7th floor. Fabian was still there, smoking heavily and visibly agitated. He greeted the officers and showed them the room and window, claiming that Ivan had jumped out. During the investigation, several glass shards were found. While the officers inspected the apartment, Fabian spoke with his ex-wife and other relatives who had witnessed the incident. In this conversation, the man emphasized to the relatives that everything happened because of Ivan, who jumped out of the window during the conflict. Before the police left the apartment, the owner of the apartment explained the argument between him and the deceased. According to Fabian, he found the boy at home in the arms of his daughter. He claimed that the teenager was afraid of him and decided to flee through the window. Nestor, Tamara's uncle, tried to support the father's version, stating that the teenager wanted to descend to the 6th floor, but couldn't hold on and eventually fell. Sometime after the police officers left, Tamara left the apartment and went to the Ortiguera family's house. There, she met Lucia, Ivan's 14-year-old sister, who couldn't believe what had happened after hearing about the incident. Finally, the girl ran to her parents and told them what she had heard from Tamara. Ivan's older brother, Bruno, was the first to arrive at the scene, immediately running there barefoot after learning about the tragic event. Juan Domingo followed him by car a little later, while the rest of the family stayed home, unable to imagine the extent of what had happened to Ivan. Later that evening, the authorities took Fabian into custody, charging him with assaulting the young man and causing him serious bodily harm. The man spent only a few hours in police custody and was released after a brief interrogation. However, a few days later, after a preliminary autopsy, the prosecutor demanded Fabian's arrest. This time he was charged with manslaughter, as it was found that Ivan was unconscious at the time of the fall. Meanwhile, Tamara was admitted to a psychiatric clinic for a few days, where she received the necessary care and support. She was able to leave the hospital shortly afterward and felt better. Moreover, a few weeks later, the girl found new love. After the autopsy, Ivan's body was laid to rest in the presence of his relatives. Around 4 p.m., the coffin was taken to the municipal cemetery. During the ceremony, Juan Domingo, Ivan's father, had to see a doctor because he became ill due to the shock he had been experiencing lately. It was a very difficult and sad time for all the young man's relatives, as they still couldn't come to terms with his death. Nevertheless, the attendees showed their love and respect for Ivan and his family. At the end of the ceremony, they released several dark balloons into the sky as a sign of remembrance and farewell to the deceased. Meanwhile, the investigation into Ivan's death continued. The investigators considered several versions of the events that day. The first version was that the young man, trying to escape from his girlfriend's father, decided to flee through the window but collapsed and fell to the ground. The second version was that Fabian deliberately pushed the teenager out of the window during an argument. The members of Ordovera's family believed the second version. According to them, Tamara's father had been following their son and threatening him with death at every encounter. More than 2 years after the young man's death on February 26, 2014, a trial took place in which Fabian's guilt was proven. Fabian had been in custody the entire time. The most important evidence was the testimonies of witnesses who lived in the apartment above the one where the incident occurred. The respondents testified that on that day, they heard screams and other noises from the walls of the building. They reported hearing Tamara pleading with her father, "Ivan, stop hitting him," and the boy's own pleas. The neighbors also recognized statements from the accused that prompted the young man to jump out of the window. One of the neighbors could generally describe some details of the conflict as she was on her balcony at the time. She observed the exact moment when the attacker pushed the victim out of the window and then checked to see if he had fallen to the ground. The woman also noted that, in her opinion, Ivan was unconscious at that time. She attributed this to the fact that Ivan made no attempt to turn around or cover his head. Finally, she stated that she regularly received threats from Fabian's relatives. Subsequently, the defendant's lawyers presented testimonies from 5 people who were members of the same family and were directly at the crime scene. They all claimed Ivan voluntarily jumped out of the window to avoid a conflict with Fabian. Tamara's mother testified that she was in the kitchen at the time of the fall and was supposedly arguing with her ex-husband. She also stated that she saw the man fall. According to her, he fell backward as if diving into a swimming pool. However, it was unclear how she could have seen this from another room. Such inconsistencies undermined the credibility of other testimonies. According to the relatives of the accused, it was unclear why the young man would commit such an act, especially whether it was caused by Fabian's aggression. The prosecution and the plaintiff's lawyers made it clear that Ivan was a balanced young man who had no conflicts with others, did not suffer from depression, and had never attempted to harm himself. The young man's relatives supported the claim that he was regularly harassed by Fabian. During the trial, it was also revealed that Fabian repeatedly threatened the deceased's father with regular visits. Psychologists involved in the case characterized the attacker as a person with a rigid character and impulse control issues. They believed that a lack of self-control might have led to the aggression against the victim. Additionally, experts found an unhealthy form of attachment between Fabian and his daughter. They noted signs of excessive jealousy towards the child. As a result, authorities filed another complaint against Fabian to determine if he had violated his daughter's sexual integrity. Unfortunately, the results of this investigation were not disclosed. During the trial, the autopsy results were revealed, showing that Ivan had fractures in his jaw and nasal septum. These injuries were most likely the result of a series of strong and targeted blows to those areas. It was established that such injuries often lead to unconsciousness. Moreover, it was determined that the nature of the injuries excluded the possibility that they were caused by the victim's impact with the ground, as the injuries would have been more pronounced. All this indicated that Ivan was already unconscious at the time of the fall, and therefore could not have escaped through the window. This explained, for example, the absence of injuries to the young man's hands, which he apparently did not instinctively use to protect himself. The autopsy also revealed that the victim's death was almost instantaneous due to respiratory arrest resulting from multiple injuries. The experts who conducted the autopsy further explained that the fall mainly impacted the teenager's back, as evidenced by severe injuries typical of a fall onto the back. They also ruled out the possibility that the deceased climbed through the broken window himself, as there were no traces on his fingertips, indicating contact with sharp or uneven surfaces. In the final part of his statement, the expert mentioned that he had the opportunity to examine Fabian. During this examination, he found an injury on the man's wrist, likely caused by the victim's blows. following the officials who conducted the autopsy. A representative of the toxicology lab testified. According to the specialist, no traces of illegal substances or alcohol were found in the deceased's blood samples. In other words, everything indicated that Ivan did not voluntarily jump out of the window. The distance between the young man's body and the building wall also suggested this. It was found that the fall occurred at an unnatural angle, typical of a forced ejection, rather than a voluntary jump. Calculations showed that the victim was thrown out of the window, and the fall time was only a few seconds. Finally, it was time to hear the defendant's statement. Fabian repeated his earlier version that Ivan voluntarily and intentionally jumped, stating that Ivan let go of his hands and humbly jumped out of the window. He insisted that there was only an argument between him and the young man, without any physical aggression from his side. Fabian claimed that Ivan remained conscious the entire time he was in the apartment and never lost consciousness for even a second. He also shared his daughter's words, who once told him about the man's problems caused by frequent family conflicts. In other words, Fabian tried to emphasize that the boy was acting based on his perception of the situation. The preliminary verdict was announced on March 14, 2014, at 10 a.m. At the start of the trial, it was determined that Fabian originally did not intend to kill the young man. This was due to the length of the conflict, which lasted 1.5 hours. However, according to the judges, something happened that caused the accused to lose control. Initially, he struck Ivan several times hard enough to render him unconscious. Upon seeing him in this state, Fabian decided to throw him out of the window. Based on these findings, Norberto Fabian was found guilty of the aggravated murder of a minor and sentenced to life imprisonment. Additionally, the court ordered him to pay financial compensation to the deceased's family to cover both moral damages and various court costs. In November 2016, the Supreme Court concluded the case by upholding Fabian's life sentence and excluding the possibility of further appeal. The young man's family was very pleased with the court's decision, but they will never be the same again. They have not forgotten Ivan and regularly remember him on social media and in their everyday lives. In honor of their angel, they even got tattoos, as they called him.